A United States Army Adjutant General's clerk sat behind a metal desk in a prefabricated office building in Vung Tau in the autumn of 1969, held a set of official Australian Army promotion documents in his hands, looked at the rank printed on the cover sheet, and slid them back across the desk with 3 words that would ignite one of the most quietly explosive administrative confrontations of the entire Australian-American alliance in Vietnam. That rank doesn't exist. He wasn't confused. He wasn't joking. He had consulted his official United States Army rank tables, cross-referenced the Australian officer designation printed on the forms, found no corresponding entry in any American personnel manual, and concluded, with the complete bureaucratic confidence of a man who had never been wrong about paperwork in his life, that the Australian Army had sent him documents for a rank that the United States military did not recognize. The Australian nursing officer sitting across that desk, a woman who had spent more than a year working 12-hour shifts in the wards of the 1st Australian Field Hospital, who had triaged blast injuries and malaria cases and shrapnel wounds while mortar rounds fell close enough to rattle the surgical instruments, looked at him with an expression that witnesses described as the particular kind of patience one develops after a very long war. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked him to look again. Wait, what? An American Army clerk had looked at the promotion papers of an Australian female military officer serving in active wartime service and decided her rank simply did not exist because it wasn't listed in American tables. The rank existed. The commission existed. The war she was serving in was the same war. The hospital was the same hospital where American soldiers woke up from surgery to find Australian nurses standing at the end of their beds. And none of that was sufficient to prevent a man with a standardized form and a limited imagination from deciding that a woman's military rank was administratively invisible. This story gets more complicated than you think, because what unfolded in the hours and days after that clerk slid those papers back across his desk, the telephone calls that were made, the senior officers who were roused from their duties, the formal correspondence that was generated and filed and eventually circulated to military administrators on both sides of the Pacific, none of it would have happened if the United States Army had spent 10 minutes understanding the structure of the organization it was operating alongside. And buried inside the institutional friction that resulted, inside the memos and the apologies and the revised guidance, is a story about something that went far beyond paperwork. It is a story about what happens when 2 military cultures carry completely different assumptions about who belongs in a war, and what rank means when worn by a woman. Stay with me. To understand what happened at that desk in Vung Tau in 1969, you need to understand something that most histories of the Vietnam War leave out entirely. When Australia sent its first group of nurses to Vietnam in May of 1967, it was not sending auxiliaries. It was not sending civilians in uniform. It was not sending women in a support capacity who technically didn't count as soldiers. Australia was sending commissioned officers of the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps, the RANC, a corps with a documented history stretching back to the formation of the Australian Army Nursing Service in August of 1898. These women held commissions. They held ranks. They wore uniforms that carried Australian Army rank insignia, identical in structure to the insignia worn by every other commissioned officer in the Australian military. A lieutenant in the RANC wore the same pip that a lieutenant in the infantry wore. A captain wore 3 pips. A major wore a crown. There was no asterisk, no footnote, no administrative caveat that reduced the weight of those rank insignia, because the person wearing them was a woman. This was not a minor distinction. The rank had been designated as a proper corps of the Australian Army in February of 1951, absorbing the older Royal Australian Army Nursing Service and giving its members full standing in the military hierarchy. The corps badge carried the motto Pro Humanitate, for humanity, and the women who wore it had served in Korea, in Malaya during the emergency, in Japan with the British Commonwealth Occupation Force after the Second World War. By the time the first 4 nurses, Captain Amy Pittendray, Lieutenant Colleen Mealy, Lieutenant Margaret Ahern, and Lieutenant Terry Roach, stepped off the aircraft in Vung Tau in May 1967, the Australian Army had been commissioning women as full officers for nearly 2 decades. These were not novel appointments. These were career professionals operating within a well-established military structure. The first 4, quickly nicknamed the Fab Four by the Australians, and eventually by everyone else who worked alongside them, were attached to the 8th Field Ambulance at Vung Tau. The work they inherited had been performed by male medical orderlies, and the transition was immediate and unambiguous in its demands. Terry Roche said it plainly in later years. You didn't look after malaria, or bomb injuries, or people with shrapnel wounds back in the civilian wards at home. In Vung Tau, those patients arrived by helicopter at any hour, and the nurses on duty worked until the work was done, regardless of what the clock said. The hospital operated in a gray concrete building near Back Beach, surrounded by sand and the constant background noise of military logistics. When Australian forces sustained casualties during major operations, the ward population could double overnight. During the malaria outbreak of 1968, the nursing staff worked without additional reinforcement, while patient numbers climbed beyond what any reasonable planning had anticipated. On the 1st of April 1968, the 1st Australian Field Hospital formally replaced the 8th Field Ambulance's medical facilities, expanding the operation significantly. The hospital at Vung Tau now had the capacity to support approximately 125 personnel in total. It provided care not only to Australians, but to New Zealand soldiers, to South Vietnamese civilians, to Allied troops from other nations, and to enemy wounded brought in under the terms of the Geneva Conventions. Major Nellie Espy, who served as matron of the hospital during 1969 and 1970, was a career officer who had joined the Australian Army in 1958, served in Malaya the following year, and had accumulated 11 years of military nursing experience before she ever set foot in Vietnam. She wore the rank of major. She held the appointment of matron. She ran the nursing operations of an active wartime hospital. None of these facts were ambiguous within the Australian Army chain of command. They became ambiguous the moment they crossed into contact with American administrative systems. The United States Army of the Vietnam era had its own tradition of military nursing, built around the Army Nurse Corps, which had been established in 1901 and had served in every major American conflict since. American Army nurses held officer rank, but the administrative culture surrounding them, the paperwork, the promotions, the institutional reflexes of the American military bureaucracy had developed along a specific track that made certain assumptions. American Army nurses were commissioned officers, yes, but they existed within an American system that processed their paperwork through American channels, recognized American rank designations, and operated within the logic of American personnel management. When an American nurse was promoted, the form looked a specific way. When a rank was printed on a document, it corresponded to an entry in an American table of organization. The system was self-referential in the way that large bureaucracies tend to become. It worked perfectly as long as everything inside it was American. The problem was that Vung Tau was not only an American operational area. The first Australian Logistics Support Group had been anchored in Vung Tau since April of 1966. The Australians operated the Peter Badco Club, named for the Australian Major, who earned a Victoria Cross serving with the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam before his death in April 1967. The Kevin Wheatley Stadium bore the name of Warrant Officer Kevin Wheatley, another Victoria Cross recipient. The port itself was critical to Australian logistics. The first Australian field hospital was an Australian institution, staffed under Australian command, answering to the Australian chain of command, through its matron, through the Director of Medical Services at Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam in Saigon, and ultimately through Canberra. It was not an American hospital with Australian nurses attached. It was an Australian hospital that happened to share a town with thousands of American soldiers. When American military personnel, adjutant general clerks, logistics administrators, personnel specialists working at various American headquarters in Vung Tau or at Long Binh, encountered Australian officers in an administrative context, they were encountering a foreign military system that used familiar language but operated under completely different internal rules. The rank of captain in the Australian Army meant the same thing as the rank of captain in the American Army in terms of its position in the hierarchy. It was the third officer grade, above lieutenant and below major. But the paperwork looked different. The administrative processes were different, and when an Australian document landed on an American desk, the American administrator's first instinct was to translate it into American terms. This worked reasonably well for combat arms officers whose ranks mapped cleanly across. It worked less well for specialist corps officers, and it worked worst of all for female officers, because the American administrative imagination of 1969 had a harder time extending its instinct for institutional translation to women wearing rank that the American system associated with men. This is the context in which the incident at the adjutant's desk occurred. A promotion document had been generated within the Australian chain of command, recommending an officer of the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps for advancement in rank. This was a routine administrative event by Australian standards. The RANC ran its own promotion processes. Its officers were assessed by their Australian commanding officers, their records were reviewed, their time and grade was considered, and when the criteria were met, the documentation was prepared and processed. For administrative coordination purposes, the sharing of information between Allied forces operating in the same general area, the deconflicting of records that might otherwise create confusion at shared facilities or in combined operations, this paperwork passed through channels that brought it into contact with American administrative offices. What happened next says less about any individual American clerk than it does about a systemic gap that had been present in American military training since the first Australian unit arrived in country in 1966. The clerk consulted the resources available to him, which were American resources, and found that the rank designation on the Australian document did not correspond to any entry in those resources. The rank title structure was distinct from the Army Nurse Corps designation. The forms looked different. The supporting notation was formatted differently, and the clerk, operating within the perfectly logical confines of a system that had never bothered to account for the possibility of Allied female officers with their own distinct institutional designations, applied the most bureaucratically defensible conclusion available to him. If it wasn't in the American table, it didn't exist. The Australian response moved with the particular speed that the Australian military reserved for insults to its institutional dignity. The officer whose papers had been rejected, or a senior colleague acting on her behalf, the precise sequencing of who made which call first has been obscured by the passage of time and the classified nature of some of the relevant correspondence, escalated the matter through Australian channels within hours. The Australian Force Vietnam Provost and administrative structure at Vung Tau was well practiced at navigating the interface between Australian and American institutions by 1969. There had been frictions before, ranging from the serious to the absurd, and the Australians had developed a practiced set of reflexes for dealing with them. The reflexes involved, in rough order, a calm initial protest at the level where the problem occurred, an immediate escalation if the initial protest was dismissed, and a willingness to go all the way to the top of whatever chain was available if the escalation was not resolved quickly. The administrative friction over the nursing officer's promotion papers triggered escalation almost immediately, because the clerk's response had not been a polite confusion that could be resolved with a brief explanation. He had been firm. He had, in effect, issued a determination. The rank didn't exist. That determination, in Australian military culture, was not an ambiguity to be negotiated. It was an error to be corrected, and the correction needed to be official and documented so that the same error could not occur again. The senior Australian officer who took up the matter, a figure working through the administrative and liaison channels that connected the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group to the American headquarters at Vung Tau, arrived at the relevant American office and made the Australian position plain. The rank existed. The commission was valid. The promotion papers were legitimate documents of the Australian Army, which was an allied force operating under its own command structure with the full legal authority to commission, promote, and administer its own officers. The fact that those officers happened to be women did not alter any of these institutional realities. The Australian Army had been commissioning women as military officers since 1951. The rank had been a full corps since the same year. An American clerk's inability to locate a corresponding entry in an American manual was an American administrative failure, not an Australian institutional deficiency. This argument was delivered, by all accounts, with the kind of controlled professional force that Australians bring to bureaucratic confrontations of this type, measured in tone, exhaustive in detail, and completely immovable in its conclusions. The American officer who received it was apparently not surprised. There is evidence in the pattern of subsequent correspondence that American personnel officers in Vietnam had encountered similar friction before, in milder forms, and that the accumulation of smaller incidents had already begun to register as a systemic problem in American administrative awareness. The nursing officer's case was simply the one that generated enough heat to produce formal documentation. What made the case of the rank officer's promotion papers particularly resonant was the specific context in which the friction occurred. By 1969, the 1st Australian Field Hospital had been operating in Vung Tau for more than a year. It had treated thousands of patients. Its nursing staff had worked through conditions that would have challenged any medical facility in the world, let alone one operating out of a compound in a coastal Vietnamese town in the middle of a war. The nurses worked shifts of 12 hours, routinely extending them when patient loads required. An outbreak of malaria in 1968 had stretched the wards beyond their planned capacity without any increase in nursing staff. The operating theater had run continuously for days at a time during periods of heavy casualties. The women who staffed that hospital were not theoretical soldiers. They were practicing professionals whose competence had been demonstrated in the hardest possible circumstances. And yet, the administrative machinery of the larger Allied force occupying the same town could not process the paperwork that represented one of those professionals receiving a promotion she had earned through that demonstrated competence, because an American clerk had never been trained to recognize the rank structure of an Allied corps that had been operating alongside American forces for 3 years. The gap between the operational reality and the administrative failure was, to Australian eyes, a kind of institutionalized absurdity. The nurses were real, their rank was real, their service was real. The administrative category of female commissioned officer of an Allied army was apparently not real enough to exist in American paperwork systems. This was not a personal prejudice on the part of the clerk, or rather, it was not only a personal prejudice, it was a structural one, baked into American administrative processes by decades of operating within a self-contained national system that had never built in the mechanisms for recognizing foreign officer categories, particularly foreign officer categories held by women. The broader context of women in the Australian military in 1969 adds another layer to the story. The rank nurses in Vietnam were operating under institutional constraints that their male counterparts did not face. Until the 1970s, female nurses of the same rank as male Australian officers were not paid equally. The equal pay correction came only after the first male nursing officers entered the Rayancy, and it became impossible to justify the differential. Women who married were, until reforms in the early 1970s, at risk of administrative discharge on that basis alone. The professional landscape for women in the Australian Army, while far more advanced than in many comparable forces in terms of commission status and operational deployment, was still structured by a set of assumptions that treated female service as a special category rather than a default one. The rank nurses in Vietnam were keenly aware of these inequities. They had, in many cases, spent their careers navigating an institution that respected their professional competence while simultaneously building structural limitations around it. When an American administrative clerk added a new layer of institutional non-recognition to the existing stack of professional burdens, the reaction within Australian nursing circles was not surprise. It was a kind of grim recognition, another variation on a familiar theme. The formal resolution of the specific incident involving the promotion papers followed the pattern established by earlier Australian-American administrative conflicts in Vietnam. A senior Australian officer made the appropriate representations to the relevant American authorities. The American Adjutant General's office, that had responsibility for the administrative interface with Allied forces, was notified. The paperwork was, eventually, processed. The promotion stood. The Australian officer received her new rank, which had always existed, had always been valid, and had been delayed only by the combined weight of institutional unfamiliarity and administrative inertia. The broader resolution, the attempt to prevent the same kind of failure from recurring, took somewhat longer and produced documentation that circulated through American administrative channels in the Vung Tau area and eventually to the wider Military Assistance Command Vietnam administrative apparatus. The guidance that resulted, addressed in the dry bureaucratic language of military administration, the basic requirement that American personnel processing Allied documents familiarize themselves with Allied rank structures before concluding that those structures did not exist. The guidance was careful in its framing. It did not characterize what had happened as a failure of institutional respect, though that is what it was. It characterized it as a training deficiency, a procedural gap, a matter requiring correction through education rather than through accountability. American military administration was, in this as in other things, better at generating forward-looking guidance than at looking backward at what the failure had actually represented. What the Australian nursing officers themselves understood, and what the formal documentation could not quite say, was that the failure had been shaped by two compounding assumptions operating simultaneously in the same administrative mind. The first assumption was that Allied rank structures could be evaluated against American tables, and that anything not found in those tables was presumptively invalid. This was the same category of error that had produced friction between American military police and Australian warrant officers. The reflexive conversion of foreign military categories into American equivalents, with anything that didn't convert neatly dismissed as a translation error rather than a genuine difference. The second assumption, inseparable from the first in this specific case, was that a woman's military rank existed within a different administrative category than a man's, a softer category, a provisional category, a category that required more verification before it deserved the same automatic institutional respect that a male officer's rank would have received. It is worth sitting with that second assumption for a moment, because it explains something that pure administrative incompetence cannot fully account for. American military clerks in Vietnam processed enormous volumes of unfamiliar paperwork. They encountered Allied documents constantly. In many cases, they processed those documents without fully understanding them, applying reasonable approximations and forwarding the results up the chain. The decision to stop processing an Australian document entirely, to return it with a determination of non-existence rather than a request for clarification, suggests something more specific than confusion. It suggests a judgment call, and the judgment call, however it was consciously framed, had the effect of treating a female officer's rank as presumptively questionable in a way that a male officer's rank in the same situation likely would not have been. The 43 Australian women who served with the Rayangs in Vietnam between 1967 and 1971 carried, throughout their service, the particular weight of being the only women in their operational environment. Not the only women in Vietnam. There were civilian nurses, Red Cross workers, Vietnamese women in every role imaginable. But the only women in the specifically military world of the Australian compound at Vung Tau, the only women in the formally commissioned sense of the Australian force structure. They worked alongside Australian infantrymen, artillerymen, engineers, and logisticians, all of whom understood perfectly well what a rank officer's rank meant and how to respond to it. Within the Australian bubble of Vung Tau, the chain of command was clear. The matron of the 1st Australian Field Hospital exercised her authority. The nursing sisters exercised theirs. The institutional framework supported them. Beyond that bubble, in the territory where Australian institutions met American ones, the framework became unreliable. American officers who had worked alongside Australian forces for extended periods generally developed a functional understanding of Australian rank and a practical respect for it. But Vung Tau was a town with constant personnel rotation. American soldiers came through on rest and recovery leave. American clerks and administrators cycled in and out on their own posting schedules. The institutional knowledge that individuals acquired was not systematically captured in training or guidance. Every new cohort of American personnel had to learn from scratch that the Australian Army existed, that it operated on its own terms, and that its officer corps included women who held genuine commissions and expected those commissions to be treated accordingly. The nurses themselves developed adaptive strategies. They learned which American facilities were likely to create administrative problems. They learned which officers and NCOs to contact when friction arose. They maintained networks of informal relationships that could be activated when the formal system failed. Lieutenant Ruth Page, who served in Vietnam in 1969, described in later accounts how the Australian medical staff navigated the social and institutional landscape of Vung Tau, a landscape that was familiar enough to be legible and different enough to require constant translation. The translation was exhausting in the way that all boundary work is exhausting. It required constant vigilance, constant calibration, constant readiness to explain things that should not have required explanation. When Jan McCarthy arrived in Vung Tau in May of 1968, she stepped off the aircraft to find gray concrete and sand everywhere. She had 12 months of war ahead of her. In those 12 months, she would work through casualties from Long Tan's aftermath, through the grinding demands of the malaria outbreak, through nights when the operating theater ran without stopping and the wards filled faster than they could be discharged. She was a lieutenant of the Yankee. Her rank was not provisional. Her commission was not contingent. Her service was not conditional on anyone else's willingness to recognize the category she occupied. The American administrative system's occasional failure to understand this was not her failure. It was theirs. The story of that desk in Vung Tau, of those papers slid back across the metal surface with 3 words of bureaucratic dismissal, is a small story in the geography of the Vietnam War. No one died because of it. The promotion eventually went through. The administrative channels, once activated, produced the correct outcome. The guidance was updated. The training, in theory, improved. By the standards of the conflict surrounding it, the artillery barrages at Coral and Balmoral, the tunnels beneath Long Tan, the booby-trap trails of Phuoc Tuy Province. A paperwork dispute in a rear area office was barely a footnote. But small stories are often the truest stories because they capture institutional reality in the moments when the institution is not watching itself. The Battle of Long Tan produced heroism that Australia has commemorated ever since. The fight at Fire Support Bases Coral and Balmoral in 1968, where Australian and New Zealand infantry held off attacks by North Vietnamese Army regulars in some of the hardest conventional fighting of the Australian commitment, produced a record that military historians still study. These are the stories that shape national memory. The story of the nursing officers' promotion papers shaped something smaller and more durable, the daily professional experience of women who served in a war and found that the war's administrative machinery had not entirely accounted for their existence. It shaped the quiet determination of the Ryansk officers who, when the paperwork came back rejected, did not accept the rejection as a verdict. It shaped the network of Australian senior officers who understood immediately that this was not a clerical misunderstanding to be shrugged off, but an institutional failure to be corrected firmly and formally, because the alternative was to allow the failure to calcify into precedent. There is a photograph in the archives of the Australian War Memorial taken at the 1st Australian Field Hospital in 1969, showing nursing staff at a social gathering in the officers' mess. Major Nellie Espy, the matron, stands among her colleagues in uniform. She is wearing the rank of Major. She had earned that rank through more than a decade of military service on 3 continents. The photograph caption identifies her and her colleagues by name, rank, and corps, with the matter-of-fact precision of Australian military record-keeping. The caption does not need to explain that these ranks are valid. The Australian War Memorial does not annotate its photographs with assurances that the women pictured actually held the commissions attributed to them. The documentation speaks for itself within the Australian system that created it. The friction arose at the boundary between that system and another one. It always arises at boundaries. Bureaucracies are designed to process the familiar with efficiency, and they fail at the unfamiliar in ways that reveal their underlying assumptions. The American Adjutant General system in Vietnam had been designed to process American military paperwork. It extended its capabilities to Allied forces imperfectly, and it extended them to female officers of Allied forces with a particular kind of imperfection that was not purely administrative. It was cultural. It reflected assumptions about who belonged in a military, what rank meant when worn by a woman, and how much verification was required before a female officer's institutional standing received the same automatic processing that a male officer's standing received without question. The rank nurses understood this. They had been navigating it, in one form or another, throughout their careers. They navigated it in Vietnam the way they navigated every other challenge the war presented, with professional competence, institutional solidarity, and a patience built on the absolute certainty that they were right. The rank existed, the commission was valid, the service was real, and the war, whatever else it was, did not require anyone's administrative recognition to be happening. In the autumn of 1969, after the promotion papers had been processed and the guidance had been updated, and the American Administrative Office had been notified in formal terms that Allied officer ranks were to be treated as valid without reference to American tables, the first Australian field hospital continued its operations. The ward rotation continued. The helicopter pad received its casualties. The operating theater ran its 12-hour cycles and longer when the situation demanded. The nursing sisters worked their shifts, held their commissions, wore their rank, and delivered medical care to soldiers of multiple nations in conditions that would have tested a facility 10 times its size. Lieutenant Barbara Black, who had served in Vietnam, died of illness in 1971 after her return to Australia, the only death associated with rank service since the Corps was formed. She was the only one to die, but all 43 who served in Vietnam carried the war home with them in one form or another. Later, oral histories captured what they had seen: the blast injuries and the burns, and the young men who arrived in pieces and left, if they were fortunate, slightly less broken. The nurses were instructed on their return not to speak of their experiences. Many did not speak of them for decades. The silence was its own kind of institutional erasure, different in character from the administrative erasure of a clerk who couldn't find their rank in a table but related to it in origin. Both belonged to the same broader failure of the institutions surrounding these women to fully account for what they had done. The accounting has been slow. The Fab Four, Pittendray, Mealy, Ahern, and Roach, became the beginning of a story that Australia has gradually, incompletely recovered from its own official silence. The first Australian field hospital has its monuments. The 43 nurses are documented in the records of the Australian War Memorial. Major Nellie Espy, who retired from the Army in 1983 as matron-in-chief with the rank of colonel, described her service in these terms: "I joined the Army to nurse sick and wounded soldiers. I can think of no better way to serve my country." That sentence contains everything that needs to be said about what the ranch officers brought to Vietnam and what they gave in giving it. And somewhere in the archival record of the Australian-American Alliance, in the correspondence files of the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group, or the administrative records of Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam, or the filing cabinets of the American Adjutant General's office that processed Allied paperwork in Vung Tau, there is the paper trail of what happened when an American clerk looked at an Australian nurse's promotion documents and told her that her rank didn't exist. The rank existed. It was right there on the paper. It had been there since February of 1951, when the Royal Australian Army Nursing Corps became a corps of the Australian Army and began issuing commissions that it intended to be taken seriously. What didn't exist, what had never been properly built into American administrative systems, despite 3 years of side-by-side operations in the same theater, was the institutional capacity to see those commissions for what they were without requiring an Australian officer to explain. Again, that the army she served in was real, her rank was real, and her promotion papers deserved to be processed. The clerk learned. The guidance was updated. The paperwork went through. The war went on. The nurses kept working. But the moment when those documents came sliding back across the desk, the 3 words delivered with the complete confidence of a man who had never considered that the universe might contain rank structures his tables hadn't prepared him for, that moment stayed. It stayed in the way that small, precise injustices stay, not as tragedy, but as information. Information about how institutions behave at their edges, about what gets seen and what gets missed when administrative systems meet the people who fall outside their default assumptions, about the particular kind of professional dignity required to sit across a desk, watch your own service reflected back at you as a category error, and calmly, quietly insist on the correction. The rank officers who served in Vietnam never asked for mythology. They asked for what every commissioned officer asks for, to be treated according to their rank, their record, and the standards of their profession. The mythologizing came later, as it always does, after the silences broke, after the oral histories were recorded, after Australia's long reckoning with how it had treated the men and women who served in Vietnam began to surface in memorials and commemorations and revised official accounts. The nurses marched in the Vietnam Veterans Day parades that for years did not properly include them. They attended reunions where the institutional frameworks that had shaped their service were finally examined with something approaching honesty. They spoke, when they were ready to speak, about what the war had actually been: 12-hour shifts and shortages, and the specific quality of focus required when the person on the table in front of you is 17 years old, and his wounds are not compatible with survival, and you work anyway because working is the only thing that makes any sense. Against that backdrop, a paperwork dispute sounds minor. It is minor in the scale of things, but the history of how institutions treat the people they claim to serve is written in minor incidents, accumulated over time, forming a pattern that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole shape. The shape, in the case of women in the Australian military during Vietnam, was the shape of a profession that had admitted women as full officers, commissioned them, deployed them to an active war zone, and then periodically failed to fully process the implications of what it had done. The American administrative failure at that desk in Vung Tau was an extreme version of a tension that existed within Australian institutions too. The gap between formal commissioning and genuine institutional incorporation, between having a rank and having that rank automatically, reflexively, completely respected. The women who served closed that gap through their service. They closed it the way all institutional progress gets made in military organizations, through demonstrated competence that accumulated into a record impossible to ignore, through careful escalation of incidents that could have been dismissed but were not, through the quiet insistence of professionals who understood that yielding on questions of institutional standing was not a minor concession but a fundamental one. The 43 nurses of the Rank in Vietnam left a record that their corps, their army, and eventually their country has spent the decades since working to appropriately honor. The working is still not complete, but it is happening. That rank doesn't exist. It did. It always had. And the woman to whom it belonged knew it, had always known it, and was prepared to wait for the rest of the world to catch up.